Hello, hello out there in Cumberland Land. I'm really pleased to be hosting the True Crime panel for this year's online crime coming with Sarah Horton and Matt Johnson. If you could give us a quick summary of the plot or the story behind your book, Sarah. We'll start with you. Now move to Matt.
Thank you. The story behind my book is that over 6-7 years ago, I discovered that I had a police ancestor who worked on the Jack the Ripper investigation. And this is my great-great-grandfather, Harry Garrett. And as I say, he was a Whitechapel police sergeant based at Lemon Street Police Station, which was the headquarters of the Jack the Ripper investigation. And having made that discovery, I was so thrilled that I decided to write a book in his honour, and One-Armed Jack, Uncovering the Real Jack the Ripper, is that book.
If you could give us a quick summary of your book, please, Matt, because there's two different area periods. Yeah.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah. Well, I think most people will know me as a novelist, writer, and some will know the story that I came to writing quite by accident through the means of therapy for treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. I think probably what less people will be aware of is that the story behind that post-traumatic stress, the illness, everything goes back to 1984 when, as a young PC on the Met's traffic department, I escorted an ambulance from Regent Street to the Westminster Hospital. And inside that ambulance was a friend of mine called Yvonne Fletcher, who was a WPC. Yvonne had been shot outside the Libyan embassy that morning during a demonstration, and she died of her wounds in the hospital. A few years ago, I was invited to join a long-term campaigner called John Murray, who's been trying to secure justice for the murder of Yvonne Fletcher and has been attempting to unearth the truth behind her killing, because nobody has been prosecuted for it. And there were some very strange rumours going on about the time about what had really happened that day. And there was a truth waiting to be surfaced. As I say, a few years ago, we did a Victoria Derbyshire reunion programme. And during the course of that recording, he asked me if I would consider making a break from novel writing, good word, I made that one up, by the way, novel writing, to write my first true crime book. And so I there began the story of writing the book, which we eventually titled No Ordinary Day, because the day that Yvonne killed to all of us was no ordinary day. And the truth that it revealed that it was absolutely no ordinary day.
Before we go into the questions, I'll also explain to the audience why I'm here if they didn't see me at last year's festival. My name is AJ Hawley, and I'm one of the co-writers of Two Writers, One Story, which is a biography of my own life as a reviewer of crime fiction, and also my background in criminology and law. So, because of my background in criminology, I've always had a fascination with true crime, and that's why I'm here today. Because the reality behind crime is always important when trying to write crime fiction, and I think that you can get a lot from reality and the reality behind crime in trying to write fiction. So that's why I wrote my book. But anyway, with the two books that we're focusing on today, looking at two different crime periods, but both elements of the police. What would you say that you learned about that you didn't know about the police before you started researching? We'll go from there again.
Well, Matt has a lot of expertise in this area. My book is all about Victorian policing, and I suppose I did learn how similar in many ways many of the tools and techniques are to the modern police officer, in terms of, for the Jack the Ripper investigation, appeals were made to the public, rewards were offered, there were house-to-house, door-to-door inquiries, many suspects were interviewed. The detectives did plainclothes work, including surveillance operations. So many of these aspects of policing may sound familiar today, but they didn't have the forensics, the CCTV, and other tools which clearly would, I'm sure, have enabled them to solve the case.
Well, what about you, Matt? As Sarah says, you've got a lot of experience.
Yes.
You must have learned some different things as well, I suppose.
I think one thing most policemen would tell you is that the policeman hasn't been born, the policeman who doesn't exist, who knows it all. You can't be an expert in all fields. If you're a good investigator, you might not be a good traffic cop, for example. If you're a good traffic cop, you might be no good at armed policing. So there are so many different facets to policing, and there is no one-size-fits-all person that is an expert in all fields. I think the biggest thing for me was when I started researching, and I did a lot of research at the National Archives, looking into cabinet papers and the like that were recorded, documented 20 and 30 years ago, and which eventually, through the passage of time and under the rules that they must be disclosed, or should be disclosed to the National Archives. And these documents are sitting there in the main, waiting for a nosy Parker like me to come along and start digging and reading. And what I learned really, which shouldn't have been a surprise, but which was just how involved politics is, how the tentacles of politics run throughout policing, through everything, through operational demands on policing, through decisions, through resourcing. Politics and policing go hand in hand. And going back to the 1980s, there was a growing struggle for control in how policing of the United Kingdom operated, and the police wanted to be solely independent. The politicians wanted to ensure that police didn't act independently of the will of government. Both noble priorities. There was only going to be one winner, and so the research disclosed.
It's really complicated politics for you as well, Sarah, because there was a lot of issues around religion and to do with the Ripper period and anti-Semitic stuff that you covered in your book. How would you say that politics flavored the story that you uncovered when you were doing the research?
I think particularly the pressure that was exerted on the police by the press and by the public, and those two sort of, the press and the public sort of created this sort of vortex of pressure on the police to solve the crimes. And the police were dealing with a serial killer, so he needed to be stopped before killing again. And so there was pressure to save lives. And that went through the whole of the political hierarchy through, you know, the Home Secretary, the Prime Minister, and even up to Queen Victoria, who wrote several letters to the police about the case, really querying the competence of the detectives and asking quite discerning questions about whether they'd been searching, you know, the docks, the London docks. Could it be a sailor who was coming in periodically, killing and then reboarding ship, which might explain how he eluded capture? And I think it was really the press sensationalism and that pressure which came across very strongly to me in terms of the political element of the case.
Interesting to hear here how there were armchair experts even in those days.
Yeah.
Because Alex, we see so much more of it these days because of the introduction of social media and the opportunity for people to communicate so very easily. You know, everybody who's watched Line of Duty has become an armchair expert in policing, and they've all got an opinion. And I know, you know, many police officers in senior investigating roles and things and so on and so forth, who despair sometimes of the way that the general public have been so influenced by the misrepresentation of policing in television, mostly, which has created completely false expectations. And there, you think, going back to the days of Jack the Ripper, there you had the Queen of the United Kingdom who expected, because she'd probably heard that things like that could happen, that, of course, I need to guide the police on how they should be operating.
Mhm.
Lovely.
Yeah, it's quite surreal to think about that, isn't it? When looking at the victims of the Ripper, there's a quite little thing that just occurred to me with the issue with Yvonne, because one of the characters was called, one of the victims of the Ripper was named Long Liz as a nickname. And of course, with Yvonne being shorter than average as a policeman, that just came to mind to me. Like as we were talking, I'm just thinking the changing view of women between the two periods. I think it's quite an interesting angle that both books covered, I should say.
Why do you say that, though? I mean, even in the 1980s, when Yvonne was serving, the attitudes to women in those days, to women police officers, were you know, they'd make us feel terribly uncomfortable these days about the. I mean, in my day, WPCs were known as Doris or Plonk, and that's what they were called, a plonk, and it was only really through people like Yvonne joining and having the strength of character and the courage to get into that male-dominated world that brought about change, because eventually the blokes who were very, very quite misogynistic in those days had to accept that actually, WPCs, women officers, they might do things a bit differently, but they're nevertheless effective. And particularly when it comes to the investigation of crime, you would find that the analytical mind of the female officer lent itself particularly to criminal investigation work. And they soon proved their worth.
I think what I was pleased to discover when I looked into the Ripper case, and particularly at the victims, was that there was no sense that their lives were not held of equal worth as anyone else's, because they were casual prostitutes and down on their luck. And the attitude towards the women was wholly respectful in terms of the need to investigate their murders and indeed find the serial killer who was sort of preying on that particular type of vulnerable woman. And so I was actually extremely relieved to learn that the police had put their best men on the case and that they had done their utmost to solve it.
There's a number of issues with the Ripper case because of it going over a number of different areas within London. How much more complicated did that make it with it being separate forces at the time? Because obviously the structure changed dramatically between the Ripper period and today, but you still had different areas for the police to cover.
Yeah, I mean, I think East End policing was a particular challenge because Whitechapel was so densely populated, and it also contained lodging houses which would house, potentially thousands of transient individuals and couples. You also had the docks, so you had sailors coming in on shore leave. And they did say that Whitechapel was famous for the 3 Fs, which I'm struggling to remember politely what these were. But I think it's something like fried fish and fighting, but I may have got this slightly incorrect. But anyway, it was an extremely overcrowded, crime-ridden area, but the main crime was sort of violent muggings and that low-level criminality, although there were gangs. And so some streets were so dangerous that the constables did not patrol their beats solo. They did so as couples. And it was very usual for police when trying to effect an arrest to get a very good kicking. And so an extremely difficult and challenging area to police. And I really wonder what my police ancestor thought when drafted in January 1888 on promotion to sergeant, having been at Lewisham and Lee Green.
I can imagine how you might have felt, actually, Sarah, because I remember in 1991 when I went on promotion as inspector to Stoke Newington. At that time, Stoke Newington was the busiest police station in the whole of United Kingdom. The area suffered the highest levels of urban deprivation. It had the highest crime levels. It's incredible amount of community difficulties. And anybody who was being promoted to Stoke Newington, when you were on your promotion course prior to your appointment and it was announced that you were going to Stoke Newington, it used to be, ooh, poor you. So yeah, I can imagine how he would have been felt going into Whitechapel, because it's like going into the frying pan. It's going to be a very, very challenging and difficult area to work in.
Yeah, police partnerships, especially in Yvonne's case, because without the police partnership, you wouldn't have had the book and everything wouldn't have come about, because the relationship with Yvonne and
John Murray.
John, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, that was an exceptional relationship, and you're right when you say that the story wouldn't have come about if it hadn't been for that friendship, because John and Yvonne weren't romantically involved at all. They were just friends, but they were very good friends. And in the ambulance after Yvonne was shot, when she was conscious, he was talking to her, and she was, even at that moment, aware that she'd been shot. She was determined that she was going to catch the person who had been responsible for shooting her. He promised her, and he made her this promise, that he would not rest until he had done that with her. Now, of course, he didn't know at the time that she was going to die, but when she did, he didn't forget that promise. And his story, his 40-year campaign, has been a remarkable one. he has taken the most incredible risks. He's traveled to very dangerous places in search of the truth. He's interviewed people who the Met Police themselves couldn't get to. John could go up to the door of Abu Salim prison, one of the most notorious prisons in Libya, and ask to see a potential witness. And of course, if the Met Police did the same, they would be told, no, go away. But John could, hand over a few dollars, bribe the guards, and get himself in through the door. Terribly risky, but it was something the Met itself couldn't do, because the police can't bribe their way into a prison to interview a witness. It'd be totally out of order. Couldn't do it, and any evidence they gained would be useless anyway. But John could do, because John's search was for the truth, not necessarily for the evidence that could be used in a criminal prosecution, which is what was motivating the police. And when it came to the opportunity for me to tell his story, well, I think it's the stuff that writers love,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as myself, with me being kind of dyslexic, I have to work with people all the writing I do, so I can get the partnership situation. But it must have been strange for you to come in a lot later into John's story. I knew you were there at the time, but obviously, John had been researching it for years. By the time you came in, he'd been doing it for quite a few decades.
Yeah, he had. Yeah.
What do you think the importance of how determined he was made the difference in not just being able to find the research to sort out where he got to with the court case at the end, or
Yeah, I think the key thing, Alex, was what John did was he kept the existence of the desire to achieve justice for Yvonne Fletcher in the public eye. He would regularly appear on television and on radio, and people from that time period who were aware, people who knew things, were aware he was running this campaign. So the key point came in 2012 when Colonel Gaddafi was overthrown and killed. And all the people who'd been afraid to speak while Gaddafi had been alive had stories to tell. They had information, they had intelligence that they could impart both to John and to the investigation officers from the Met. But they weren't going to come forward while Gaddafi was alive, because they were afraid for their safety and for the safety of their friends and family, particularly those that lived in Libya. Because Gaddafi was a significant, very dangerous. He's a real threat, and he wasn't a man to be taken lightly. But with him out of the way, and with the awareness, thanks to John's campaigning, they started to come forward. And as they came forward, the truth of what had been going on that day, and the reality behind the plans that had been put into effect, and who was responsible and who was involved, began to emerge. And that probably wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for John's campaigning. Because, as I say, it was only because he'd been campaigning that people knew that the Met was still interested. It was 35 years on, nearly. And most people would have thought, oh, well, it's done and dusted, it's forgotten. But no, not the case.
It's always quite interesting how long it takes for true crime stories to come out. Well, when I was thinking of your book, the one-armed Jack, because there's hundreds of theories around the Ripper case. What made you come across one-armed Jack, and why was it that theory that stuck out for you?
Well, I remained faithful to the police investigation of the day. So because of my police ancestor, I just wanted to know what their thinking was and what work they did, etc. And I discovered that CID Chief Robert Anderson, had publicly declared in 1910 that the police had solved the Jack the Ripper case with no doubt as to the identity of the criminal. Anderson provided some information about the man without naming him, and in particular the fact that a reluctant witness refused to testify against him in court, meaning that he could never be charged with his crimes. And I started to fit together a profile from what Anderson and other senior officers said about this unnamed man, and also what the eyewitnesses who saw a man consorting with the women before their murders, and on some occasions saw a man running away from the murder locations. And so I took all of these details, which contain certain identifying characteristics, and in particular, a very unusual way of walking with asymmetric foot dragging. And I managed to link them to my prime suspect, Chaim Hyams, whose medical files were released to the public in 2013 and 2015, and describe exactly those characteristics, not only sort of height, weight, build, and general appearance, but also these very distinctive physical and psychological characteristics as well.
It's amazing that you had to wait so long for the archives to be released for that. In 2013 is ages after the event.
Yeah, it was actually 100 years after his death. He died in 1913. And luckily for me, I wasn't waiting, because I first got the idea to write my book in 2017. And I was just extremely fortunate with the timing that I discovered the files and realized that there was a whole wealth of new information which had not been presented in published form.
That's so interesting, Alex, isn't it? The coincidence between it takes a person with interest in the subject to start digging and looking at information which is just sitting there waiting to be discovered, and to then apply an analytical brain to it, piece it together, and there you have a suspect who fits all the criteria that you need perfectly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when it came to the archives for you, there was a hint that I heard on the podcast. I think something to do with John le Carré, wasn't it?
Yeah. That cut a long story short. I met up at John le Carré's house in Cornwall a few years ago. I was lucky enough to sit around his kitchen table with David Cornwell, as his real name, and his wife Jane, having Cornish cream tea the correct way round, with jam first and cream on top. I just thought I'd mention that, slip that one in. And we were talking about the idea of writing this book, and he said to me that he had an idea of where I should start looking. And after we went home that day, I got a phone call from his PA a little while later, and she said, David says, have a look. And she gave me some file reference numbers to ask for at the National Archives. And when I went up there, I asked to see these particular files. And of course, they were MI5 related documents pertaining to how the Secret Service had been spying on the National Union of Mine Workers. And of course, my thoughts were, well, what on earth has this got to do with the Yvonne Fletcher story? But it had a lot to do with the Yvonne Fletcher story, because as the files revealed, the spying that was going on the National Union of Mine Workers was part of a plan to defeat the mine workers in 1984. And also as part of that plan had been the large-scale purchase of oil from Libya. in order to keep the power stations going in 1984. So, of course, when we realised that this secret deal had been done between the UK government and Libya to buy oil, you start to realise that actually what was going on with regards to Gaddafi and the attacks that were happening in the UK at the time and the eventual shooting when Yvonne was killed was that Gaddafi and his cronies, because of this deal, had the confidence of believing that they could use it to attack their enemies who were living in the UK. And because they had that confidence, they carried out those attacks in the belief that the UK government wouldn't interfere with their actions because they had this nice, cozy little secret deal going to buy their oil, and they didn't want to spoil it. So then, of course, when Yvonne is shot, and this deal risks blowing up in their faces right at the moment where the big 1984 Arthur Scargill-led National Union of Mine Workers strike is about to kick off, they have a straight choice. Either prosecute the Libyans and lose the oil deal, or let the Libyans go. And they chose the latter.
Do you believe that it was as cynical as that, Matt?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, one of the key things that we found was that the UK government was in communication with embassies all around the world less than 24 hours after the shooting happened. There are telexes going out to various places, particularly to the embassy in Libya, telling them that all the Libyans are going to be released and why. Within 24 hours, and yet the siege itself was still going on. It was still run for another 2 weeks before eventually the Libyans would be released and sent home. And the public explanation was that all the Libyans were entitled to diplomatic immunity, whereas in fact none of them were. The only Libyans who were entitled to diplomatic immunity were that at the time of the shooting at the Foreign Office, making representations to have the demonstration banned when the shooting took place. The people who did the shooting were members of the London Revolutionary Committee, who were Libyans that essentially in the UK to target the people that Gaddafi called the stray dogs, his enemies who were resident in the UK. And it really was, you know, you could understand what was going on, but it really was an insight into the pressures that happen at a very high level in government, and some of the very difficult decisions that they have to make.
It really is amazing about the hidden information you can discover when reading true crime. It was a whole new reading experience because I'd only ever done all true crime reading of books when I was doing my university degree. Reading true crime books is a challenge because all the amount of information, particularly when looking at theirs, because of all the information around the institutions where Hyams was to be held and the reasons for the gaps in the chronology is quite interesting.
Yeah, what I discovered was that senior police officers said that the Ripper had been held at Stepney Workhouse, Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum in North London, and Stone Lunatic Asylum near Dartford in Kent. And those locations are quite geographically dispersed. And Hyams was held at all three locations. In fact, he died at Colney Hatch. And as you say, there was a 3-month gap at the beginning of 1889 when he was at liberty, which potentially coincides with a City of London police surveillance operation against Jack the Ripper, which Officer Harry Cox said was of 3 months duration. So without even trying, the locations and the dates and so on matched up very neatly for me, and it does form quite a significant part of my hypothesis.
I think it's something that you learn in detective work, Alex, that there's a principle, I can't remember the name of what it is at the moment, but that sometimes the right answer is the easiest one. And I think, I mean, I've read some of the reviews of Sarah's books, and there are clearly people who are resistant to the idea that in previous years they might have got it wrong. And certainly when you read Sarah's book and it's logical, and you apply the principle of thinking, well, the most obvious answer is probably the right one.
Yeah.
This man has to be very, very high on the list of suspects. Has to be.
Yeah, because before that information came out, hundreds of theories. I mean, even just can't bother come up with a theory about mitochondrial DNA.
Wasn't there even a theory that Jack the Ripper was a member of the royal family or something?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, decidedly more and more complicated. As you say, the less complicated you can make it following the information. Yeah.
I think it's clear from the evidence that it was a local man who knew the area extremely well and blended into the background. And my suspect lived within the police cordon. So he lived on Wentworth Street, and the police were trying to establish a cordon that the perpetrator would cross when seeking to escape from the scenes of his crimes. And Chaim Hyams lived within that cordon. And it's my belief, one of the reasons why he was never caught red-handed. And I think another reason is that he was actually extremely lucky, and his timings were fantastic, despite the fact that I don't believe he was in any sense organized or highly intelligent.
Cunning. That's what he had, wasn't it? Cunning.
Yeah, and luck, unfortunately. Yeah.
I mean, the little things were really interesting. The one things I never thought about was the horse racing. The little,
Yes.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I came upon the idea of the murders coinciding with horse racing because for one of the murders, the perpetrator was seen wearing bronze or gold horseshoe tie pin. And I thought, well, you only wear like a horseshoe tie pin if you're obsessed about good fortune or you're interested in horses. And of course, there is a coincidence of dates, and gambling was a very popular pastime, and all sorts of types of gambling were held in the clubs and on the streets of Whitechapel, which was actually illegal, but didn't actually prevent them from so doing. And it might explain why the perpetrator might at times have had money to pay for the women, or to show the women that he was able to pay for their services. And it's just one of the details that I think, make the book quite a well-rounded proposition and hopefully a fascinating read. But talking about levels of detail, there's something I wanted to raise from your book, Matt, which is a real highlight of the book, which was the recovery of Yvonne Fletcher's hat from outside the embassy when under siege. And so it might be nice if you could tell that story.
Well, I can tell it from my perspective, actually, because I was denied permission to go to Yvonne's funeral. I think the funeral was taking place on the Friday, and I'd been denied permission, and I was asked to go on a night duty the previous night, and as part of that night duty, we were asked for volunteers to go into the square to remove vehicles from the square using the police removal tools to clear the area around the embassy when something happened. What happened was the most amazing thing, because a certain PC, a chap by the name of Clive Maybury, who was an ex-paratrooper, who was a beat PC working at a place in Lewisham in South London, had read in the newspapers and seen on the news about Yvonne's hat and how it sat in the middle of the square. And the hat was wanted to be placed on Yvonne's coffin, as was traditional and remains traditional. And it hadn't been. It was still sitting there, and it was like a bit of an icon. And a lot of policemen were not very happy. A lot of the public were not very happy about the fact that the Libyans wouldn't allow this hat to be removed. Now, a couple of plans had been hatched to recover the hat, one of which was the use of a Springer Spaniel gun dog that had been trained out at Heathrow Airport on a WPC's hat, and had been taught to run across the street, grab this hat, and recover it to a safe position. And the dog handlers who'd worked on this had perfected it to the point where they were confident that if they went down to St. James's Square, their dog could be sent across the square, would pick Yvonne's hat and would bring it back. And this was going to take place, but unfortunately, the press got wind of the story and they printed it, as a result of which the Libyans heard about the story, said to the hostage negotiators, do not send that dog out into the street to recover that hat, implications being that they might shoot at it. So the plan was abandoned. But PC Clive Maybury knew nothing of this. So what he did was he got himself placed on a group of police officers who were being sent up to central London that day to just provide a guard around the area. And during the course of their night duty, he said to his inspector that he'd like to sneak off and just go to the toilet. So he went off, but he didn't go to the toilet at all. What he did was he snuck in through the big blue screen which was blocking St. James's Square. He blagged his way in through there by speaking to an inspector he knew, saying that he wanted to have a sly cigarette behind the back of the screen. He managed to bluff his way all the way up to the armed points at the front of St. James's Square. And then, while I was standing right next to the point where the arms post was, so I was there at the same time, I suddenly saw this figure whiz past me out into the square. Just a glance, I think, what on earth was that? And then I hear this firearms inspector shouting, get back, get back. We think, what the hell's going on? Next thing I know is Clive Maybury appears from the darkness out of the square, clutching this hat in his fist, to then be arrested by the firearms inspector and another one of the armed officers and taken away across the street to the NatWest Bank, which was being used as one of the forward control points. And he was taken in there. He was interrogated. And eventually, he was released, sent back in disgrace to Lewisham. But of course, the boys at Lewisham had heard what he'd done, and he was greeted like a hero. He on the following day, he was taken up to New Scotland Yard to be carpeted by an assistant commissioner, where he thought he was going to be sacked on the spot, but he wasn't. He was actually told not to be a naughty boy and not to make a habit of doing these kind of things. And eventually, he was made a freeman of the City of London for what he did. Amazing story.
Amazing, yeah.
Yeah, he a real character. One of those crazy things that sometimes happens during the most traumatic of times.
It is quite phenomenal, really. I mean, just think the level of details. I mean, as I was reading the book, I was my dad was supposed to be reading his own book at the time, with the level of detail, and he just couldn't he just couldn't read his own book because he got your book on audio at the time, and it just like this is because he's around the same age as yourself, so he knew all about the period and just got really fascinated. Yeah, the level of detail, particularly in true crime books, is really important, and sometimes make you feel as if you're there, particularly in both cases when you're describing locations. I mean, when Sarah says about how Hyams may have escaped in the back routes of all the locations of the Ripper murders, is quite intriguing, because I don't know whether you've got a map in the book, Sarah, but it's quite intriguing. Obviously, I was listening to it on audio, so I don't know whether there is a map.
There's a map inside the jacket. And at the end of each of the murder chapters, I do a reconstruction of the murder, speculatively, if Hyams had committed it. So I work out where I think he accosted the women, how the situation played out, and then what his potential escape route would have been, given the fact that he was undetected. Although the City of London police at the time said that Jack the Ripper was chased from the scene of Mitre Square, one of the murders, to Artisans Buildings, where Hyams' brother Mark was living at the time. So, of course, I include that in my crime reconstruction for that particular murder. But I did very much enjoy walking the streets of Whitechapel, because the blueprint of the streets is then as now is fairly similar, despite all of the building work that's taken place. And you certainly on occasion get a sense of the atmosphere that might have been typical in Victorian times.
Sarah, it sounds very much like you were analysing the case almost from the perspective of a prosecution barrister who might have been prosecuting the case and pointing out all the huge number of coincidences and factors which, when all seen together, paint a very clear picture of someone's guilt.
Yes, because it wasn't my original intention to come up with a new prime suspect. I wanted to write a book in honour of my police ancestor, and I wanted to follow in the footsteps of the police of the day. But I didn't realise that I would find someone who so exactly fitted Robert Anderson's profile, and in fact other profiles drawn up by, among others, the FBI in 1988. And when I made that discovery, I wrote a book that was purely about my suspect. And as you say, all of the different coincidences of timing, place, physical and psychological characteristics, motivation, and so on. And luckily for me, because of the pandemic and my original difficulty in getting published, I had a lot of time to think about it. And I think I went to that level of detail, and there's a depth of analysis in my book that I might not otherwise have achieved.
I think that the time it took, and you say about how difficult was it with the amount of theories out there? Yeah.
I found it difficult in the beginning because there's a wealth of information about Jack the Ripper, as you say, the kind of hundreds of different suspects, a lot of different theories. But when I went back to what the police of the day publicly stated about the case and the original Police and Home Office papers, I realised I just needed to cut through all of the extraneous material and keep to the police reports, the eyewitness accounts, the inquest hearing testimony, and so on. And, you know, that really helped me to formulate a very fact-based hypothesis.
One of the key parts of it, and your book, Matt, was how you described the challenge of the court case and getting that in. Because as a former law student myself and someone that been involved in the courts for quite a few years as a volunteer, I saw the level of detail you got into there as well. I think that if that level of detail hadn't have been there, I don't think we would have realised how much trouble John had gone to, I think.
Yes, absolutely. And there's another parallel here, as we were talking about with Sarah's investigation that she did with her book too, because in these kind of writings, in these kind of investigations, the kind of research, and then you're putting the book together, you've got no access to forensic evidence. You can't tie someone to the scene in a way that clearly indicates that they are the killer. And so you have to build a picture as if you were a prosecutor, as I did, and John did, and John's legal team did, in order to demonstrate that this particular gentleman, if I can call him that, was responsible for organising the attack during which Yvonne was killed. So he was the lead protagonist in the attack. The same kind, there's no forensic to tie him to it. It's all about witness testimony. It's all about documents. It's all about data, intelligence, and reports and things, and putting things together. And eventually, the case becomes so compelling that it's very difficult for a jury, the reader, to look at it and say, you're wrong. You hope. You present that case. You present your case, and then you argue, say, could all these coincidences have happened? Could all these facts, these unrelated things? There's only one answer, and it's the most obvious one, that this person is guilty of the offence.
Yeah, it's always really interesting. Because normally with the true crime things, with my dyslexia and stuff, I watch it through the TV. It's so different reading it in a book because of the amount of information there. And I'm just thinking, as we get to the end of the time, what would you say is the easiest way to sum up the hardest challenge in writing true crime versus fiction, particularly for you, Matt, because obviously you've written.
For me, it was the acceptance that in writing true crime, it's not like writing crime fiction, because in crime fiction, generally speaking, in fact, almost exclusively, you have a satisfactory conclusion at the end. It's one of the reasons that people like crime fiction, because even though the most terrible things might happen through the story, there's a satisfactory result. There's a sense of justice at the end. In true crime, that's not so necessarily the case.
What would you say that was your satisfactory conclusion then, Sarah? What would you say that you was aiming for? Because as you say, that wasn't your initial plan when you started writing, because you were hoping to emphasise the role of the police and your relative at the time. It wasn't an idea.
Yeah, I wanted to honour my police ancestor and by extension the police of the day, who did a brilliant job and in my opinion solved the case. And I also wanted to create a really thrilling read despite being wholly fact-based, but a book which would sort of enthrall the reader and also allow the reader to make their own conclusions. So I put forward, I think, a very good case for my prime suspect, but I did want to make the reader think about all of the different aspects and complexities of the case and go away thinking they know more and they've had a challenging experience. Whether or not they agree with my hypothesis is something separate, I believe.
That's a really interesting way to, and because as you say, with true crime, it's not essential for the reader to agree with you, your hypothesis, because debate in true crime is really important. Yeah. I'm just going to end by saying that I've really enjoyed today and really enjoyed learning some new elements about both your books, because even though I'd read them and we'd had a prior discussion before this panel today, as is always the case, you always learn new things as you're doing the panel itself. Thanks very much, and I'll just say to everybody out there, don't forget to book for Aberystwyth in August next year, when it's being run from the 25th to the 27th of August. Yeah, I think that's everything. Was got anybody else got anything to say before?
I'd just say thanks very much for the opportunity. It's been great talking. Great. Thanks for the opportunity for the reading as well, which has been super. So it beats sitting watching television, even if I occasionally watch true crime on television as well.
Yeah, thank you both very much.
No problem at all. I really enjoyed it. Yeah. Doubtless, as I keep doing these panels, I keep being asked in more and more unusual things, and I love to do things I've not done before. Thanks to both of you.